The desert wind carried dust and secrets across the New Mexico territory. In the summer of 1878, through this harsh landscape, rode a man who'd learned long ago that words were wasted breath and emotions were dangerous luxuries. His name was Caleb Stone, though few people ever got close enough to use it. Caleb wasn't the kind of man you'd notice in a crowd, and that's exactly how he preferred it. Average height, weathered face, clothes that blended into the brown and gray of the frontier. But his eyes told a different story. They were the color of storm clouds, and they'd seen things that would break most men. The war had done that to him. 6 years since the last shot was fired, but some battles never really end. He made his living hunting men, not for sport or revenge, but for gold. Wanted posters were his gospel, and he followed them with the dedication of a priest following scripture. His rules were simple enough that even a child could understand them. Never ask why a man was wanted. Never care about his story. Never let anyone get close enough to matter, and most importantly, never take a job that didn't pay in hard coin. These rules had kept him alive through a dozen close calls and twice as many gunfights. They'd also kept him alone, but Caleb told himself that was just fine. Alone meant safe. Alone meant simple. The town of Redemption Gap wasn't much to look at. A handful of wooden buildings fighting a losing battle against the desert, a church with a crooked steeple, and a saloon that saw more business than the general store. Caleb rode in just after noon, when the sun turned the main street into a furnace and smart people stayed in the shade. He was tracking a cattle rustler named Pete Dockery, wanted for stealing livestock from ranches across 3 counties. The bounty was decent, nothing special, but work was work. Caleb had traced him to this nowhere town through a series of careful questions and a few well-placed bribes, but as he guided his horse down the dusty street, he noticed something wrong. Too many people gathered in the center of town. Too quiet for a crowd that size, the kind of silence that comes before violence or right after it. Caleb's instincts, honed sharp by war and survival, told him to turn around. This wasn't his business. Whatever was happening in that square had nothing to do with Pete Dockery or the bounty on his head. He should water his horse, ask a few questions, and move on. He almost did exactly that. But curiosity, that dangerous human trait he thought he'd killed years ago, made him edge his horse closer. He stayed back in the shadows near the blacksmith's shop, just another drifter watching the local drama unfold. What he saw made his jaw tighten. A man stood on a wagon bed, a rope around his neck, hands tied behind his back. He wore simple black clothes and a white collar. A preacher. The man's face was bruised and bloodied, but his eyes were clear, calm even, like he'd made peace with whatever was coming. Below the wagon, a big man in expensive clothes sat on a fine horse. Everything about him screamed money and power. His smile was the worst part, wide and satisfied like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "Any last words, Reverend?" the big man called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried the lazy confidence of someone who'd never been told no. The preacher lifted his head. When he spoke, his voice didn't shake. "I forgive you, Dutch Corrigan, and I pray you'll find your way back to—" Corrigan's laugh cut him off. "Save your prayers for yourself." He nodded to one of his men, a rough-looking character holding the horse's reins. The crowd stirred but didn't move. Caleb could see it in their faces. Fear. The kind of fear that turns good people into cowards. They wanted to help. Maybe some of them even loved this preacher, but not one of them would risk standing up to Corrigan. Caleb knew the type. Every frontier town had one. A man who'd grabbed power through money or violence or both, and held on to it by making sure everyone knew what happened to people who challenged him. "He stole from me," Corrigan announced to the crowd, playing to them like an actor on a stage. "Took cattle from my land to feed those homesteaders squatting on property they got no right to. That's theft, plain and simple, and out here we handle thieves the frontier way." "Those people were starving," the preacher said quietly. "Children were. Should have thought about that before breaking the law." Corrigan's voice went hard. He raised his hand. Caleb watched from the shadows. His hand didn't move toward his gun. His face showed nothing. This wasn't his fight. He'd seen plenty of men hang, most of them deserving it more than this preacher probably did. But the world was full of injustice, and one man couldn't fix it all. The hand dropped. The wagon lurched forward. The rope went tight. It was over in moments that felt like hours. The crowd stood frozen. some looking away, others staring with the sick fascination people have for death. A woman's scream cut through the silence, raw and broken. She'd pushed through the crowd and now collapsed in the dust beneath the hanging body. Young, maybe 25, with dark hair coming loose from its pins. Even from a distance, Caleb could see her condition. Pregnant, 7 or 8 months along by the look of it. The preacher's wife. She didn't cry the way most women would. Instead, she knelt there in the dirt, one hand reaching up toward her dead husband's feet, and began to pray. Her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Caleb couldn't make out all the words, but he recognized the rhythm, the 23rd Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the crowd began to break up, people drifting away like they couldn't get away fast enough, trying to forget what they'd just allowed to happen through their silence. The town marshal, a pot-bellied man with a badge that looked more like decoration than authority, made a show of cutting the body down. Frontier justice, he announced to no one in particular. All legal and proper. Caleb finally moved his horse, turning away from the square. He needed to find Dockery, collect his bounty, and get out of this town before whatever corruption lived here tried to stick to his boots. He made it halfway to the saloon before he stopped. The woman was still there, sitting in the dust beside her husband's body. Someone had thrown a blanket over him, a small mercy. She sat with her hand on the blanket, her lips still moving in prayer. The sun beat down on her without mercy, and not a single person from that crowd had stayed to help her. Caleb sat on his horse, having an argument with himself. Logic said keep riding. His rule said this wasn't his concern. Experience said that getting involved with other people's troubles was a good way to end up dead or worse. But something about the way she sat there, alone with her grief and her courage, made him think of other women, other losses, things he'd buried deep because remembering hurt too much. He dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling in the quiet street. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and walked toward her, each step feeling heavier than the last. She looked up as his shadow fell across her. Her eyes were green, he noticed. The kind of green that reminded him of spring grass, of growing things and life continuing despite everything. They were red from crying, but steady, looking at him without fear, even though he was a stranger and she had every reason to be afraid of strangers right now. Caleb held out the canteen. He didn't say anything because he didn't know what to say. What words existed for a moment like this? She took it with a small nod, drank, and handed it back. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded back and turned to leave. That was enough. A small kindness to ease his conscience, nothing more. You're not from here, she said behind him. He stopped but didn't turn around. No, ma'am. Good. Her voice was quiet but firm. This town died today along with my husband. Nothing good lives here anymore. Caleb walked back to his horse and rode away without looking back. He told himself he'd done his part. Offered water. That was more than most would do. But as he rode toward the saloon, he couldn't shake the image of those green eyes or the sound of her steady voice praying over her dead husband. Something about it had gotten under his skin, past the walls he'd built so carefully. He told himself it meant nothing. By tomorrow he'd have his bounty and be gone. This town and its troubles would fade into memory like a dozen others before it. He had no way of knowing how wrong he was. No way of knowing that the woman kneeling in the dust would change everything about the life he'd built on silence and solitude. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a gun or a rope. Sometimes it's just one person who looks at you and sees something worth saving. Caleb spent the evening tracking down information about Pete Dockery. Turned out the rustler had moved on 2 days prior, heading toward Colorado territory. Another dead end, another wasted trip. He should have been frustrated, but his mind kept wandering back to that square and the woman sitting in the dust. He took a room above the saloon, planning to leave at first light. The bed was lumpy, the walls were thin, and he could hear every word of the card game happening below. But he'd slept in worse places. Much worse. Sleep didn't come easy, though. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that preacher standing on the wagon, calm as Sunday morning. Saw the woman's hand reaching up toward her husband's feet. Heard her voice speaking those ancient words about walking through valleys of shadow. Around midnight, someone started shouting in the street. Then came the smell. Smoke. Caleb was at the window in seconds, his instincts screaming danger before his mind caught up. Fire lit up the night sky too. 3 blocks over. The church. Flames were already climbing the walls, turning the crooked steeple into a torch. He grabbed his gun belt and was down the stairs before he'd fully thought it through. People were stumbling out of buildings, pointing and talking, but nobody was moving toward the fire. Nobody was trying to help. "The widow's in there," someone said. A woman's voice, and scared. She wouldn't leave. "Been sitting with her husband's body since this afternoon." Caleb's feet were moving before his brain gave permission. He pushed through the small crowd, ignoring their warnings. The heat hit him like a wall when he got close. The whole front of the small parsonage next to the church was engulfed, flames eating through the dry wood like it was paper. The door was locked or blocked. He didn't waste time checking. Using his shoulder, he hit it twice before it gave way. Smoke poured out thick and black, choking. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth. It wouldn't help much, but it was better than nothing. Inside was hell. Flames crawled up the walls and across the ceiling. The heat was incredible, like standing too close to a forge. His eyes watered and he could barely see 3 feet ahead. "Hello?" He called out, his voice rough. "Anyone here?" No answer. Maybe she'd gotten out already. Maybe she wasn't even in here and he was risking his neck for nothing. He should leave. Should save himself. But he pushed deeper into the house anyway. He found her in what must have been the bedroom, collapsed on the floor near a window she'd been trying to open. The frame had swollen shut from the heat. She wasn't moving. Caleb grabbed her under the arms and lifted. She was lighter than he expected. Or maybe adrenaline made her feel that way. He half carried, half dragged her toward the door, trying to stay low where the air was clearer. A beam fell from the ceiling, missing them by inches. Sparks showered down, burning through his shirt. He ignored the pain and kept moving. They made it through the door just as part of the roof collapsed behind them. Caleb dragged her away from the building, into the street where people stood watching. He laid her down gently, checking for breathing. She coughed, a wet rattling sound, and her eyes fluttered open, those green eyes now bloodshot and confused. "You're all right," he said, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Just breathe slow," more coughing. She tried to sit up and he helped her, supporting her back. Someone brought water and he held the cup while she drank. "My husband," she said, her voice like gravel. "He was not in there," Caleb said quickly. "They took him to the church earlier. He's safe," she nodded, understanding what he meant. Safe because he was already gone, beyond the reach of fire or any other harm. "Who started it?" someone in the crowd asked. "That fire didn't start itself. Corrigan's men," another voice answered. "Saw them riding away right after it started." The widow closed her eyes. She didn't look surprised. Just tired, so incredibly tired. An older man pushed through the crowd carrying a medical bag. He had the kind of face that had seen everything and wasn't easily shocked. "Let me look at her," he said to Caleb. "I'm Doc Whitmore." Caleb stepped back, suddenly aware that his hands were burned and bleeding. The doctor noticed too. "You'll need treatment yourself. Come by my office once I've got her settled." "I'm fine," Caleb said automatically. "Son, you've got second-degree burns on both palms. You're not fine, but we'll see to her first." They got the widow to the doctor's office, which was really just a room attached to his house. The place smelled like carbolic acid and old coffee. Doc Whitmore checked her over carefully while Caleb stood by the door, not sure why he was still there. "Smoke inhalation, some minor burns, but she'll recover," the doctor said finally. "The baby too, far as I can tell. Heart's beating strong." Relief flooded through Caleb, surprising him with its intensity. He barely knew this woman. Shouldn't care this much. Where will she go? The doctor asked no one in particular. Can't stay at the church. Corrigan's claimed the property for unpaid debts. Unpaid debts? Caleb couldn't help himself. That's ridiculous. That's power, the doctor corrected. Corrigan owns half this town and has the other half too scared to speak up. The Reverend was the only one brave enough to challenge him, and you saw what happened. The widow was conscious but quiet, staring at the ceiling with those tired eyes. "She has family?" Caleb asked. "A sister," Doc Whitmore said. "Married to a rancher up near Santa Fe, 300 miles north. 300 miles through some of the roughest country in the territory. Apache land, outlaw country. And if Corrigan wanted her dead, he'd have men watching the roads. Someone needs to take her," the doctor said, looking directly at Caleb. "And it needs to be someone who can handle trouble." "Not my problem," Caleb heard himself say, though the words felt hollow. "No, I suppose it isn't," the doctor agreed. "You just happened to pull her from a burning building. Clearly you don't care at all." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I got business elsewhere." "Chasing bounties?" The doctor's voice wasn't judgmental, just stating facts. How much was Pete Dockery worth? Couple $100? 300. I can pay you 100 to escort her to Santa Fe. It's all I've got saved, but it's yours if you'll do this. $100 to risk his life for 300 miles. It was insulting. He could make more than that taking on easier work, safer work. Why me? Caleb asked. Because you're still here, the doctor said simply. Everyone else in this town is either working for Corrigan or too scared to cross him. But you walked into a burning building for a stranger. That tells me something about who you are, even if you've forgotten it yourself. Caleb looked at the widow. She was watching him now, those green eyes steady despite everything she'd been through. She didn't plead, didn't beg, just looked at him with a question in her gaze. Why would a man like you save someone like me? She asked quietly. It was the same question she'd asked that afternoon in the street, and he still didn't have an answer. Not a good one anyway. The smart play was obvious. Leave tonight. Ride north and pick up Dockery's trail in Colorado. Forget this town and everyone in it. His rules had kept him alive this long for a reason, but those rules suddenly felt like chains instead of armor. I leave at dawn, he said finally. We travel light and fast. No stops unless absolutely necessary. Any delay could get us killed. The widow nodded. I understand. Do you? He needed her to really understand. Corrigan will send men after us. Could be 5, could be 10. They'll be trying to kill you, and they won't much care if I'm in the way. I know who Dutch Corrigan is, she said softly. I know what he's capable of. My husband knew too, and he stood up to him anyway. Your husband's dead because of it. My husband's dead because he chose to help people instead of looking the other way. Her voice strengthened. I won't dishonor his memory by being less brave than he was. Doc Whitmore smiled slightly like he'd just won a bet with himself. I'll have supplies ready by sunrise. Food, water, medical supplies, and I'll throw in my old rifle. Not much, but it shoots straight. Caleb nodded, already regretting his decision but unable to back out now. Keep her here tonight. I'll come get her first light. He turned to leave, but she spoke again. What's your name? He paused at the door. Caleb Stone. I'm Rebecca Hayes, and thank you, Mr. Stone, for the water this afternoon. For pulling me from the fire. For this. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and left. Back in his room, Doc Whitmore's assistant came by to bandage his hands. The burns hurt worse now that the adrenaline had worn off. Every movement pulled at damaged skin. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what he'd just agreed to. 300 miles with a pregnant widow and a target on both their backs, for a third of what his usual work paid. His rules had been clear. Never get involved. Never let anyone matter. But somewhere between that dusty square and the burning building, those rules had started to crack. And Rebecca Hayes, with her steady green eyes and quiet courage, had gotten past his defenses without even trying. He told himself it was just a job. Just an escort service that happened to pay poorly. Nothing more. But deep down in a place he'd locked away years ago, Caleb knew this was different. Knew that riding out at dawn would change something fundamental about who he was. The question was whether he was ready for that change. Outside his window, the ruins of the parsonage still smoldered, sending smoke signals into the night sky. A warning, maybe, or a beginning. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would test everything he thought he knew about himself. They rode out before the sun cleared the horizon, when the desert air still held a hint of coolness. Rebecca sat her horse better than Caleb expected. No complaints, no request to slow down. She kept pace with the determination that spoke of frontier stock. Women who'd learned early that survival meant being tougher than the land. The first 2 days passed without incident. They traveled through empty country, broken mesas and scrub brush stretching endlessly in every direction. Caleb kept them off the main trails, following paths that only someone with military training would know. Longer routes, but safer. Rebecca didn't talk much, which suited him fine. But on the third morning, they came across a family broken down on the side of a narrow canyon road. A wagon with a busted wheel, a man and woman maybe in their 40s, 3 small children huddled in the shade. Keep riding, Caleb said quietly as they approached. Rebecca pulled her horse to a stop instead. They need help. Not our problem. They have children. Which is why we should keep moving. Where there's broken wagons, there's often bandits who broke them on purpose. Old trick. The man had seen them now, was waving his arm. His wife held a baby. Couldn't have been more than a year old. The other kids looked scared and sunburned. "Please," the man called out in accented English. "We need help with wheel." Mexican, Caleb noted. Probably heading north looking for work or family. The desert was full of people chasing dreams that usually ended in disappointment or death. "We don't have time," Caleb said to Rebecca, keeping his voice low. She looked at him with those green eyes. "How long would it take you to fix a wagon wheel?" "That's not the point." "How long?" He sighed. 20 minutes if I had the tools. "Maybe 30. Then we have time." She nudged her horse forward before he could argue. Caleb cursed under his breath and followed. His hand stayed near his gun, eyes scanning the rocks above them. Perfect ambush country, but it wasn't a trap. Just a family with bad luck and a wheel that had cracked on a rock. The man's name was Miguel, his wife Rosa. The children watched Caleb with wide, nervous eyes. They'd probably been warned about gringos with guns. Rebecca climbed down from her horse, moved slower than usual. Caleb noticed but didn't comment. She went straight to Rosa and the baby, started talking in surprisingly good Spanish. The tension in the woman's shoulders eased. "You know their language," Caleb observed while he examined the wheel. "My husband served a mission in Mexico before we married. He taught me." Of course he did, Caleb thought. The Reverend probably spoke 6 languages and healed the sick in his spare time. The wheel needed more than fixing. It needed replacing. But Caleb had rope and knew how to improvise. He showed Miguel how to bind the cracked wood tight enough to hold for another 50 miles if they went slow. "Where are you headed?" Rebecca asked them. "My brother has a ranch near Albuquerque," Miguel explained. "He says there is work, good land. Better than Chihuahua." "That's still 100 miles north," Caleb said, tying off the last rope. "That wheel won't make it." Miguel's face fell. Rosa looked like she might cry. Rebecca dug into her saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. She handed it to Miguel. "There's a trading post about 20 miles ahead. They'll have a wheel. This should cover it." Caleb's jaw tightened. That was probably all the money she had in the world. "Senora, we cannot," Miguel started. "You can and you will," Rebecca said firmly. "For the children." They left the family with directions to the trading post and continued north. Caleb didn't speak for an hour. His irritation simmered like water on a slow boil. "That was foolish," he finally said. "That was human. Being human gets you killed out here. Then maybe out here needs more humanity, not less." They rode in silence after that. But it wouldn't be the last time. On the 5th day, they found a child. A boy, maybe 7 years old, sitting by a dried-up creek bed. Apache by his clothing and the way he watched them approach. No fear in his eyes, but something worse. Resignation. "We're not stopping," Caleb said before Rebecca could open her mouth. "He's a child. He's Apache, which means his family is probably within shouting distance, and they won't take kindly to whites riding through their territory. He's alone. You don't know that." But as they got closer, Caleb could see the kid was in bad shape. Dehydrated, sunburned, 1 foot wrapped in bloody cloth. He'd been walking for a while, probably got separated from his band somehow. Rebecca was off her horse before Caleb could stop her. She approached the boy slowly, hands visible, speaking soft words he probably didn't understand. She offered water from her canteen. The boy drank like he'd been wandering for days. Probably had been. "We need to leave him," Caleb said. "His people will find him. Or he'll die first. That's not our responsibility." Rebecca looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd started this journey, he saw anger in her face. "When did you become so cold? Were you born this way, or did life make you like this?" The question hit harder than any punch. Caleb felt something twist in his chest. "I became this way by staying alive," he said quietly. "Every time you help someone, you take a risk. Every delay, every stop, every act of mercy is a chance for Corrigan's men to catch up. Is that what you want? To die out here because you couldn't pass by a stranger?" "My husband died helping strangers," she said, her voice steady despite the tears forming in her eyes. "He died because he believed that every person matters, that we're all connected, that turning away from suffering makes us less than human. I won't dishonor his memory by becoming like the men who killed him." The words cut deep because they were true, because Caleb had spent years turning away, looking past, riding by. It was easier that way. Safer. But easier and safer had left him empty in ways he'd refused to examine. Fine, he said, the word coming out harsher than he intended. We'll take him to the next Apache camp we see. But we don't linger. They found tracks that afternoon, signs of a hunting party moving east. Caleb followed them while the boy rode double with Rebecca. The kid still hadn't spoken, but he'd stopped looking quite so much like he expected to die. The Apache camp was small, maybe 8 lodges. Warriors came out with weapons ready when they spotted riders approaching. Caleb raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. He pointed to the boy. An older woman rushed forward, crying out in Apache. The boy's grandmother, Caleb guessed. She swept him into her arms, checking him over while tears streamed down her weathered face. The warriors lowered their weapons but kept watching. Their leader, a man about Caleb's age with scars that told stories of hard battles, stepped forward. "You brought our son back," he said in surprisingly good English. "Found him by the creek," Caleb replied. "Figured he belonged with family." The leader studied them both carefully. His eyes lingered on Rebecca's condition, on her traveling clothes, on the way she sat her horse like someone running from something. "You are pursued," he said. It wasn't a question. Caleb didn't bother lying. Maybe. White men on horses came through yesterday. They asked about a man and woman traveling north. I told them we saw no one. A chill ran down Caleb's spine. Corrigan's men were closer than he'd thought. "Why lie for us?" Rebecca asked. The Apache leader looked at her with something like respect. "Because you could have ridden past our son. Most whites would have. You did not." He gestured to the mountains. "There is a path through those peaks. Difficult, but it will take you north while avoiding the men who search for you. I will send my nephew to show you the way." They left an hour later with a young Apache guide who spoke no English, but knew every rock and canyon in those mountains. The path was narrow, dangerous, definitely not suitable for wagons or large groups. Perfect for 2 riders trying to disappear. That night, camped in a hidden valley, Rebecca finally spoke about what had been building between them. "You think I'm foolish," she said, warming her hands by the small fire. "I think you're going to get us killed. But you keep stopping anyway. Even when you argue against it, you still help them." Caleb poked at the fire with a stick, not meeting her eyes. "Someone has to keep you from getting scalped." "That's not why." Her voice was soft but insistent. "You help because part of you wants to. Part of you remembers what it's like to care about people. You don't know anything about me. I know you pulled me from a fire when you could have ridden away. I know you complain about every delay, but your hands move to help before your mouth finishes protesting. I know that underneath all that armor you've built, there's still a good man trying to get out." Caleb stood up abruptly. "You want to know about me? I killed 17 men in the war. 17 that I counted, probably more I didn't. I've hunted men for money, brought them in dead more often than alive because it's easier that way. I've watched people suffer and walked on by because it wasn't my problem. Your husband sounds like he was a saint. I'm about as far from that as a man can get." Rebecca stood too, moved closer to the fire so he could see her face clearly in the flickering light. "My husband wasn't a saint. He was a man who chose every single day to be better than his worst impulses. He got angry. He had doubts. Some days he wanted to give up. But he kept choosing kindness, kept choosing to help. That's not sainthood, Mr. Stone. That's just being human. Well, I gave up on being human a long time ago." "No," she said quietly. "You just convinced yourself you did. But I've been watching you. The way you check my horse's saddle every morning to make sure it's secure, how you make sure I eat before you do, the way you positioned your bedroll between me and the trail, so anyone coming would reach you first. Those aren't the actions of a man who doesn't care." Caleb had no answer for that. He walked to the edge of their camp and stood looking out at the darkness, his bandaged hands clenched at his sides. Behind him, Rebecca's voice floated through the night air. "You don't have to be what the war made you. You can choose something different." But choice, Caleb thought, was a luxury he couldn't afford. Out here, hesitation got you killed. Mercy made you weak. Caring about people gave your enemies leverage. Yet even as he thought it, he knew she'd already proven him wrong. They'd helped 4 people in 5 days and they were still alive. Still moving north. Still one step ahead of the men hunting them. Maybe, just maybe, there was more than one way to survive. The question was whether he had the courage to find out. The Apache guide left them at dawn on the 7th day, pointing toward a pass through the mountains that would bring them within 2 days of Santa Fe. He pressed something into Caleb's hand before he left. a small carved stone smooth from handling, with symbols Caleb didn't recognize. "Protection," the young man said in halting English, then disappeared back into the rocks like smoke. Caleb tucked it into his pocket, feeling foolish but also strangely grateful. They were making good time through the pass when Rebecca's horse stumbled. She caught herself, but Caleb saw her wince, saw the way she pressed her hand to her side. "How long?" he asked, pulling his horse alongside hers. "How long what? How long have the pains been coming?" Her face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you mean. I was a field medic during the war. Saw enough pregnant women in refugee camps to know the signs." "How long?" She was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Since yesterday afternoon. They're not regular. Probably just from all the riding, or the baby's coming early. You're what, 7 months? Almost 8. Still too early." Caleb scanned the landscape around them. They were in the worst possible place for this. High altitude, exposed, miles from any settlement. "We need to find shelter. I'm fine. We should keep moving." As if to argue with her, another pain hit. Caleb saw it in the way her jaw clenched, the way her knuckles went white on the saddle horn. "We're stopping," he said, leaving no room for discussion. He found a place about a mile ahead, an old mining camp abandoned years ago by the look of it. 3 structures still standing, or mostly standing. The largest had most of its roof intact and 4 walls that blocked the wind. It would do. Caleb helped Rebecca down from her horse and into the building. Someone had left behind a stove, rusted but functional. There was even some old wood stacked in the corner, dry as bone and perfect for burning. "I need you to tell me the truth," he said, getting a fire started. "How bad are the pains?" "They're coming every 20 minutes or so. Sometimes longer. That could mean hours, or it could mean the baby was coming tonight." Caleb had delivered exactly 2 babies in his life, both during the war, both in better circumstances than this. One of them hadn't made it. He pushed that memory away and focused on what needed doing. Water from the stream outside, boiled and cooled. Clean cloth from their supplies, torn into strips. The medical kit Doc Whitmore had packed, small but complete. Night fell fast in the mountains. The temperature dropped with it, turning their breath to fog. Caleb kept the fire burning hot, kept water heating, kept watch out the broken window for any sign of pursuit. Rebecca tried to rest, but the pains were coming faster now. Every 15 minutes. Then 10. "Tell me about him," Caleb said, trying to distract her. "Your husband." She smiled despite the pain. "Daniel." His name was Daniel Hayes. He had the worst singing voice you ever heard, but he'd loved to sing anyway. Said God didn't care if you could carry a tune, only that you made the effort. "How'd you meet?" "He came to my father's ranch to buy a horse. Stayed for dinner and never really left. Proposed after 3 months, married me after 6. My father said we were rushing." Daniel said, "When you know, you know." Another contraction hit. Caleb counted. 45 seconds. They were getting longer. "He sounds like a good man," Caleb said quietly. "The best man I ever knew. Stubborn as a mule, though. Once he believed something was right, you couldn't shake him from it. That's what got him killed. He knew Corrigan would come after him for feeding those homesteaders. I begged him to stop, to let someone else fight that battle. But he said if good men stay silent, evil wins by default. He wasn't wrong. No. But I wish he'd been less right and more alive." The pain in her voice had nothing to do with contractions. Caleb found himself moving closer, taking her hand. His bandaged fingers awkward but steady. "He'd be proud of you," Caleb said. "The way you've handled all this. I don't feel very strong right now. Strength isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what needs doing anyway. You've done that every day since I met you." She squeezed his hand as another contraction came. Stronger this time. He could see fear creeping into her eyes. "It's too early," she whispered. "The baby's too small." "What if—" "Don't," Caleb interrupted. "Don't think about what if. Stay right here, right now. We're going to get through this. You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise I won't leave you. Whatever happens, you're not alone." The words surprised him even as he said them, but they were true. Somewhere between Redemption Gap and this abandoned mine. Between her acts of mercy and her quiet courage. She'd gotten past every defense he'd built. She mattered to him now. The realization should have scared him. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long sleep. Midnight came and went. The contractions were 5 minutes apart now, lasting close to a minute each. Rebecca's face was pale. sweat soaking through her clothes despite the cold. "I need to check," Caleb said. "See how far along you are." She nodded, too exhausted to be embarrassed. He'd seen worse things than childbirth, and right now modesty was a luxury they couldn't afford. Things were progressing fast. Too fast for a first baby, but stress and hard travel could do that. He washed his hands carefully, glad Doc Whitmore had included carbolic soap in the kit. "On the next contraction, you're going to need to push," he told her. "I'm scared." "I know. But your body knows what to do. You just have to trust it." What followed was the longest hour of Caleb's life. Rebecca pushed with everything she had, her cries echoing off the stone walls. He coached her through it, his voice steady even as his heart raced. He'd faced down armed men without flinching, but this terrified him in ways combat never had, because this wasn't about him, this was about her. About an innocent child who deserved a chance at life, about something pure and hopeful in a world that had shown him mostly darkness. The baby came just before dawn, small and slippery and utterly silent. Caleb's heart stopped. He cleared the infant's mouth and nose quickly, rubbed the tiny back, did everything he'd been taught. Nothing. "Why isn't he crying?" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "Caleb, why isn't he—" The baby gasped, then cried. A thin, weak sound, but the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever heard. "He's breathing," Caleb said, his own voice shaking. "He's small, but he's breathing." He wrapped the baby in the cleanest cloth they had and placed him in Rebecca's arms. The infant was tiny, couldn't have weighed more than 4 pounds. But he was alive, fighting. His little fists waved in the air like he was arguing with the world already. Rebecca cried, great heaving sobs of relief and joy and exhaustion. Caleb turned away to give her privacy, but also because his own eyes were burning and he didn't trust his voice. He'd brought death to so many. 17 in the war, more after. He'd started thinking of himself as a weapon, a tool, something built for destruction. But tonight his hands had helped bring life into the world. Those same hands that had pulled triggers and tied nooses had caught a newborn baby and coaxed breath into tiny lungs. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe you could choose to be something different than what life had made you. He heard her voice behind him. "Caleb?" He turned. She looked exhausted but radiant, the baby nursing weakly at her breast. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. What are you going to name him?" She looked down at her son, this tiny miracle born in an abandoned mine in the middle of nowhere. Daniel after his father. Daniel Stone Hayes. Caleb's throat tightened. "You don't have to— Stone for the man who saved both our lives more than once, who delivered my son when no one else could have, who proved that even in the hardest places there's still room for grace." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and went back to keeping watch. But something had shifted inside him. Some wall had finally crumbled completely. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting everything gold and red, Caleb made a decision. They'd get Rebecca and little Daniel to Santa Fe safely. That was still the plan. But after that, he wasn't going back to bounty hunting. Wasn't going back to the empty life of not caring, not connecting, not mattering to anyone. He was going back to Redemption Gap, back to face Dutch Corrigan. Not with guns blazing like the old Caleb would have done, but the right way, the way Daniel Hayes would have wanted. With law and community and justice that actually meant something. Rebecca had asked him when he'd become so cold. The truth was the war had frozen him solid. But over these past days she'd started the thaw. And tonight, holding new life in his hands, he'd finally melted completely. The journey wasn't over. They still had Corrigan's men somewhere behind them. Still had 2 days of hard travel ahead. Still had a newborn who might not survive the trip. But for the first time in years, Caleb felt something he'd thought was dead inside him. Hope. And maybe that was enough to start with. They stayed in the mining camp for 3 days. Rebecca needed time to recover, and the baby needed to get stronger before they could risk the final push to Santa Fe. Caleb spent those days hunting for food, keeping watch and learning how to hold an infant without feeling like he might break something. Little Daniel was a fighter. Despite being early and small, he nursed well and his color improved each day. Caleb found himself watching the kid sleep, amazed that something so tiny could have such a grip on life. On the morning of the 4th day, Rebecca declared herself ready to travel. Caleb had his doubts, but he also knew they'd pushed their luck staying in one place this long. They rode slow, taking breaks every few miles so Rebecca could nurse the baby. Caleb fashioned a sling from a blanket that let her keep Daniel close while they traveled. The little guy seemed to like the motion of the horse, falling asleep almost immediately. Santa Fe appeared on the horizon just after noon on the second day. Adobe buildings gleaming in the sun, church bells ringing in the distance, civilization, safety, the end of their journey. Rebecca's sister lived on a ranch about 5 miles outside the city proper. Her husband ran cattle on land that stretched as far as the eye could see. When they rode up to the main house, a woman came running out, and Caleb knew immediately she was Rebecca's sister. "Same green eyes, same determined jaw. Becca," she cried, then saw the baby and her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my lord, you had the baby? But you're early, and Daniel, where's—" The story came out in pieces over the next hour. Rebecca's sister, whose name was Catherine, cried and held her sister and marveled over little Daniel. Her husband, a quiet rancher named Thomas, listened with a face that grew darker with each detail about Corrigan and the hanging and the burning building. "You should stay here," Catherine insisted. "Both of you. There's plenty of room, plenty of work if you need it, Mr. Stone." It was the offer Caleb had expected. The smart play would be to accept, at least for a while. Rest up, let his hands finish healing, figure out his next move. But he already knew his next move. "I appreciate that. Ma'am, but I need to head back." Rebecca, who'd been quiet through most of the conversation, looked up sharply. "Back where?" "Redemption Gap. That's suicide," Thomas said flatly. "Corrigan owns that town. He's got the marshal in his pocket and enough hired guns to start a small war." "I know. Then why would you go back?" Rebecca asked. Her voice was soft but intense. She knew the answer already. He could see it in her eyes. "Because your husband was right. If good men stay silent, evil wins by default. Someone needs to stand up to Corrigan. Might as well be me. With guns." Rebecca shook her head. "That's not what Daniel would have wanted." "No guns," Caleb said. "Well, not unless I have to. I'm going to do it the right way. Gather evidence. Talk to people. Get federal marshals involved. Build a case that'll put him away proper." Catherine looked between them, clearly sensing something deeper in the conversation. "You two have only known each other for what, 10 days? But you look at each other like—" "Katie," Rebecca interrupted, her cheeks coloring slightly. But her sister wasn't wrong. Something had formed between them on that long road. Not romance exactly. It was too soon for that, too complicated. But connection, understanding. The kind of bond that forms when you've kept each other alive and brought life into the world together. "I should go," Caleb said, standing. "You've got family to catch up with." "Wait." Rebecca stood too, carefully so as not to wake the baby. "You can't just leave. Stay for dinner at least. Stay overnight. You've earned that much," he wanted to refuse. Goodbyes were easier when you didn't drag them out. But Catherine was already insisting, and Thomas was offering to show him where he could stable his horse. And somehow Caleb found himself agreeing. Dinner was simple, but the best meal Caleb had eaten in months. Real bread, roasted meat, vegetables from Catherine's garden. The conversation flowed easily, mostly talk of family and ranch business. Normal things. The kind of life Caleb had forgotten existed. After dinner, Rebecca asked if he'd walk with her. They left little Daniel sleeping in Catherine's arms and went out to the porch that overlooked the valley. "You don't have to do this," Rebecca said quietly. "Go back to Redemption Gap. You've done more than enough." "I do have to. I need to." "Why? Because you feel guilty? Because you think you owe Daniel something?" "Maybe at first," Caleb admitted. "But now it's because I want to. Because for the first time in years, I care about something more than just getting paid and moving on. You did that. You and your stubbornness and your refusal to look away from suffering. I wasn't trying to change you. I know. That's what made it work." He pulled something from his pocket. The Bible she'd given him that morning they left. The one that had belonged to her husband. "I read some of it. On watch at night while you slept. I don't know if I believe all of it. But I understand now why he did. Why you do." She took the Bible back, holding it like the treasure it was. "What part did you read?" "Different parts. But one thing stuck with me. That bit about faith without works being dead. Your husband had faith, but he backed it up with action. That's what I'm trying to do now. Not just believe things can be better, but actually do something about it. It's dangerous. Most worthwhile things are. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun paint the sky orange and purple. Somewhere in the house, the baby made a small sound and Catherine sang softly to him. "What will you do?" Rebecca asked. "After Corrigan? Don't know yet. Haven't thought that far ahead. You could come back here." Catherine meant what she said about work. "And you?" Caleb looked at her directly. "What will you do?" She met his gaze steadily. "Raise my son. Honor my husband's memory. Try to heal. Maybe teach at the school in Santa Fe. Catherine says they need someone who speaks Spanish. You'll be good at that. Will you write? Let me know how it goes in Redemption Gap." "I'm not much for letters. Try anyway," he smiled. It felt strange on his face, like his muscles had forgotten how. "All right. I'll try." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in weeks, Caleb thought about the man he'd been when he rode into Redemption Gap. Cold, isolated, operating by rules that kept him safe but empty. He thought about the man he was now. Still rough around the edges, still more comfortable with a gun than a conversation, but different somehow, softer in some ways, stronger in others. He left before dawn the way he usually did, but this time Rebecca was awake to see him off. She stood on the porch holding little Daniel, wrapped in blankets against the morning chill. "Be careful," she said. "I will. And Caleb, thank you for everything. For saving my life. For bringing my son into this world. For reminding me that there are still good men left even if they've forgotten it themselves." He nodded, not trusting his voice. He mounted his horse and turned toward the road. "Caleb?" she called after him. He looked back. "When you're done in Redemption Gap, if you need a place to rest, you know where to find us." "I'll remember that." The ride back to Redemption Gap took longer than the ride away from it. Caleb stopped in towns along the way, asking questions, gathering information. He learned that Doc Whitmore had been collecting evidence of Corrigan's crimes for years. Learned that most of the townspeople hated Corrigan but were too afraid to act alone. What they needed was someone to stand up first. Someone to show them it could be done. When Caleb rode back into Redemption Gap 6 weeks after leaving, Doc Whitmore nearly fell over in surprise. "Thought you'd be halfway to California by now," the old doctor said. "Had unfinished business. You'll get yourself killed. Maybe, but I'm tired of running. Time to make a stand." Over the next 3 months, Caleb did exactly what he'd promised Rebecca. He worked within the law, helped Doc Whitmore organize the evidence, convinced fearful townspeople to testify, and sent detailed reports to the territorial governor and federal marshals. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. Most days it felt like pushing a boulder uphill. But slowly, surely, the case against Corrigan built. The federal marshals finally came, arrested him and his hired guns, and hauled them off to stand trial. The trial took another 2 months. But when the verdict came down, it was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Corrigan would spend the rest of his life in prison. Redemption Gap started to heal. A new marshal was appointed, an honest man with no ties to corruption. The church was rebuilt and they found a new pastor. The homesteaders Corrigan had pushed off their land came back. Caleb stayed through all of it, helping where he could. He wasn't good at organizing or public speaking, but he could fix things and stand watch and make people feel safe. It was enough. One morning, almost a year after he'd first ridden into town, Caleb woke up and realized he was happy. Not content, not just satisfied, actually happy. He thought about Santa Fe, about green eyes, and a baby's cry and a woman who'd shown him that. Strength came in forms he'd never considered. He thought about a porch overlooking a valley and an invitation that still stood. Doc Whitmore found him packing his saddlebags that afternoon. "Heading out?" the old man asked, thinking about it. "Everything here is settled. Don't need me anymore. We'll always need good men, Caleb, but I understand." "You're heading to Santa Fe?" Caleb didn't answer, but his smile said enough. "Tell Rebecca I said hello, and that I'm proud of both of you." The ride to Santa Fe felt different this time. No urgency, no danger. Just a man traveling toward something rather than running away from it. When he rode up to Catherine's ranch, it was late afternoon. Rebecca was in the garden, little Daniel toddling beside her. The boy had grown so much, walking now, babbling words that almost made sense. She looked up when she heard the horse. Her hand went to shade her eyes against the sun, and then she was walking toward him, slowly at first, then faster. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." I was beginning to wonder. Had to finish what I started. Corrigan's in prison. Redemption Gap is finding its name again, and you? I'm finding myself again. Or maybe for the first time. Little Daniel reached up toward Caleb, babbling something. Caleb dismounted and knelt down. The boy grabbed his finger with surprising strength. He remembers you, Rebecca said softly. He was 3 days old when I left. Some bonds form fast. You saved his life. He knows that, even if he doesn't understand it. They walked to the house together, Daniel between them holding both their hands. Catherine came out and immediately started fussing about dinner, about how long Caleb would stay, about whether he'd finally accept Thomas's offer of work. That night, after dinner and stories and putting an exhausted Daniel to bed, Caleb and Rebecca sat on the porch like they had almost a year before. What now? She asked. I was hoping you might have some ideas. Thomas really could use help with the ranch. He's getting older, and the work is more than he can handle alone. I don't know much about ranching. You didn't know much about delivering babies either. You learned, he smiled at that. Fair point. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. I'm not him, Caleb said finally. Your husband. I'll never be that good, that faithful, that certain about things. I don't want you to be him, Rebecca replied gently. I loved Daniel with everything I had. Part of me always will. But he's gone. And you're here. You're different people, and that's all right. What are we doing here, Rebecca? I think we're starting over, both of us. Building something new from what's left of our old lives. That's terrifying. Most worthwhile things are. He laughed, recognizing his own words. Then he took her hand, his scars rough against her skin. They sat like that for a long time. Two broken people finding their way towards something whole. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better. Something real, a second chance. A new beginning. A life built not on running away, but on choosing to stay. And in the distance, little Daniel dreamed peacefully, unaware that the man who'd brought him into this world had finally found his own way home.